How China is secretly arming Iran while publicly staying neutral. China has a foreign policy principle it repeats so often it has become something of a mantra: non-interference. Beijing does not pick sides. Beijing does not supply weapons to active conflicts. Beijing is, as its foreign ministry spokesperson put it in April 2026, a responsible major country that consistently fulfills its international obligations. This is technically true. In the same way that someone who hands you a knife, a map, and a getaway car was not technically present at the crime scene. The oil for everything deal. Here is a number worth sitting with. Approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports flow to China. Not 40%. Not 60%. 90%. One country absorbs almost the entire output of another country's sanctioned oil industry, and that second country is currently at war. In 2025, Iran and China were conducting bilateral trade worth an estimated $41.2 billion annually, and that figure does not include the oil. Because most of it moves through channels that do not appear in official Chinese trade statistics. This is not a normal trading relationship. This is a financial lifeline disguised as commerce. Iran sells oil at a significant discount to prevailing market prices to entice Chinese buyers. China buys at a discount, processes it, keeps the margin, and says nothing publicly about any of it. The arrangement suits both parties. One gets hard currency. The other gets cheap energy. Here is the part nobody mentions. The Chinese entities doing most of this buying are not the major state-owned oil giants, Sinopec, PetroChina, who are too large and too exposed to U.S. secondary sanctions to take the risk. The buying is done by small, semi-independent refineries in Shandong province that traders call teapots, named for their modest size. But research found that these so-called independent refineries connect closely to the Chinese state through joint ventures and partnerships with state-owned enterprises. The independence, analysts say, gives Beijing what one expert called a degree of plausible deniability. The smaller refiners pose limited systemic risk if sanctioned individually. In other words, China built a firewall between itself and the oil trade it controls. The teapots absorb the sanctions. The oil keeps flowing. The Chinese state watches from a distance and says nothing. The shadow fleet. Moving 90% of a sanctioned country's oil to the other side of the planet is a logistical problem. Solving it required infrastructure. The solution has a name: the shadow fleet. Iranian crude travels on older tankers whose ownership is difficult to trace. These ships turn off their automatic identification systems, the maritime equivalent of a GPS tracker, while in transit. They rendezvous with other vessels in international waters for ship-to-ship transfers, which makes the original point of origin harder to establish. The cargo gets relabeled. Fake invoices get filed. By the time the oil arrives at a refinery in Shandong, it is officially not Iranian oil anymore. It is just oil. Tanker tracking firms reported Chinese discharges of Iranian crude averaging roughly 1.38 million barrels per day in 2025, before dipping to between 1.13 and 1.20 million barrels per day in early 2026. The shadow fleet adapted. Voyage times shortened from 85 to 90 days to 50 to 70 days through optimized routing and transfers. The U.S. Treasury has been sanctioning components of this system since 2018. As of November 2025, 366 China and Hong Kong-based entities were on the specially designated nationals list for Iran-related sanctions programs. 366 entities. And the oil is still moving. Here is the part nobody mentions. About 1/5 of China's total oil imports in 2025 came from Iran and Venezuela combined. The business model of independent Chinese refineries was built around that cheap, heavy, sanctioned crude. Without it, the economics collapse. So when analysts ask why China tolerates the risk of secondary sanctions, the answer is not ideology. It is margin. The dual-use technology pipeline. Oil is one layer of the relationship. The second layer is more directly relevant to the war. It is called dual-use technology, which is a bureaucratic term for things that can be used for civilian purposes, but aren't. Chinese firms have reportedly exported large volumes of precursor chemicals to Iranian entities linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Beyond chemicals, China has supplied advanced composites, precision machine tools and guidance components including gyroscopes and accelerometers. The components that determine whether a missile hits what it is aimed at, or misses by 300 meters. In January 2025, two Iranian vessels loaded approximately 1,000 tons of sodium perchlorate, a key precursor for solid rocket fuel, at Chinese ports. During the week of March 2, 2026, two more state-owned Iranian vessels departed China's Gaolan port believed to be carrying the same substance. Sodium perchlorate is the ingredient that makes a solid-fuel rocket motor work. Solid-fuel rockets are faster to prepare for launch, harder to detect on a countdown clock, and more survivable than liquid fuel alternatives. Iran's medium-range ballistic missile program runs on them. The U.S. Treasury has sanctioned individuals and entities for facilitating these shipments. The ships departed anyway. Here is the part nobody mentions. Chinese companies supply around 80% of the world's drone components. This means that when Iranian drones hit U.S. military assets in the Gulf, the components inside those drones may well have Chinese manufacturing origins. Not necessarily because China instructed anyone to build a weapon, but because China builds most of the components that end up in weapons. Enforcing the line between commerce and armament, in that supply chain, is essentially impossible. The satellite problem. In 2021, China gave Iran full military access to its Beidou satellite navigation system. It is plausible that Iran is currently relying on Beidou for its drone and missile attacks throughout the Middle East, though open-source evidence does not yet allow for a definitive assessment. Since the start of the war with the United States and Israel, Iran has reportedly used Beidou to produce decoy signals to confuse threat analysis and conceal actual Iranian military movements. Beidou is China's answer to GPS. It is more accurate than GPS in some configurations. It is not controlled by the United States, which means it cannot be degraded, blocked, or selectively denied to Iranian users by American authorities. An Iranian drone guided by GPS is theoretically vulnerable to GPS jamming. An Iranian drone guided by Beidou is not. China gave Iran access to this in 2021, 3 years before the war started. No announcement. No controversy. It was filed under Comprehensive Strategic Cooperation, and not discussed further. The new weapons and the timing. In the days leading up to the U.S.-Israeli strikes that began in February 2026, reports indicated China had delivered offensive drones, described as loitering munitions or kamikaze drones, to Iran. Reports also indicated discussions were underway over Iran purchasing China's DF-17 hypersonic glide missile. Then, in April 2026, U.S. intelligence indicated China was preparing to deliver new air defense systems, specifically shoulder-fired anti-air missile systems known as manpads, to Iran within weeks, routing the shipments through third countries to mask their true origin. The timing is notable. This intelligence emerged the same week Beijing said it had helped broker the fragile ceasefire agreement that paused the war between Iran and the U.S. China the peacemaker, publicly. China the arms supplier, per U.S. intelligence, privately. The two positions were being held simultaneously in the same week by the same government. China's foreign ministry called the reports groundless smears and malicious associations. The Chinese embassy in Washington stated that China had never provided weapons to any party to the conflict. This is a denial. It is not the same as evidence of the contrary. But the denial is notable in its own right. Beijing did not say, "We would never do this because it conflicts with our values." Beijing said, "These reports are not true." The framing is factual, not moral. The door, as analysts note, remains open. What China actually wants. The obvious question is, why? China and Iran are not natural allies. In 2025, China registered $108 billion in two-way trade with Saudi Arabia and $108 billion with the UAE, compared to $41.2 billion with Iran. The Gulf states are larger trading partners, bigger investment destinations, and they are U.S. allies. Which means antagonizing them for Iran's sake carries real economic cost. One U.S. source described China's strategy this way: Beijing sees no real strategic value in overtly entering the conflict. Instead, it is trying to position itself as a continued friend to Iran, whose oil it heavily depends upon, while remaining outwardly neutral so it can maintain deniability after the war is over. This is not friendship. This is utility. Iran provides China with discounted oil at a scale that underwrites the entire business model of an industrial region. In return, China provides Iran with the components, chemicals, satellite access, and financial infrastructure it needs to keep its military functional and its government solvent. The word for this arrangement is not alliance. Analysts use a different term, the axis of evasion. A network of U.S. adversaries that coalesce to circumvent Western economic restrictions, not through formal treaties but through commerce. Here is the part nobody mentions. The main losers of this arrangement, if the Iranian oil supply is ultimately disrupted by the war, are the Chinese refineries whose entire business model was built around cheap sanctioned crude. The primary beneficiary of that disruption is Russia, which is positioned to increase oil exports to China to fill the gap. China built a dependency on Iranian oil. That dependency is now a vulnerability. The war China did not start and has not formally entered is costing it supply security it spent years constructing. The situation continues to develop. You have been watching how China is secretly arming Iran while publicly staying neutral. The Chinese Foreign Ministry did not respond to requests for comment on this script, primarily because no one sent them one. The situation continues to develop. If you want to keep knowing things before they are on the front page, subscribe. The next video is already happening somewhere. We'll explain it calmly.